Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this evening. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this evening. And I am Yves Engler, coming to you from Tiohtià:ke, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. And screen seems to be cut in half here. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there. Um, but so the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour is a critical look at Canada's role internationally. And like most recent weeks, there's been a lot of developments in Canada's relations abroad, things to talk about. Um, Beginning with the fact that uh, the 7th of December was the 1 year anniversary of the overthrow of Peru's leftist president, Pedro Castillo. And that was a Canadian-backed coup that we are continues to it continues to be a usurper government. Castillo continues to be in jail. And on the 1 year anniversary, there's all kinds of ways that Canada has sort of solidified, consolidated the post-coup Dina Boluarte usurper government. But on the 1 year anniversary, the Maple published a piece based upon some access to information files saying that Global Affairs approved new arms export permits to Peru about 2 months after the coup. That they're dated 2 months after the coup. It's not 100% certain that that's when they were actually approved, but they're dated two months after. And I think it's about $1 million in Canadian arms that were given permits for. And of course, there was huge amounts of violence taking place against anti-coup forces at that time. So approving arms export permits is a pretty flagrant addition to some of what we already knew about Canada's support for the coup, which included all these meetings in the 6 weeks, 2 months after. Canadian Ambassador Joly, either in-person meetings or by phone meetings between Canadian and Peruvian officials to really consolidate the coup. Then at the big mining convention in Toronto, etc. It was reported a couple weeks ago now. I haven't mentioned it. I missed it. That Canada had moves to restore ties with the Venezuelan government. Diplomatic relations were broken off a couple years ago, and they've moved towards restoring ties, which is, I think, a further admission or confirmation of what was clear, which was the whole Juan Guaido exercise was not the appointing a marginal opposition politician as the legitimate president and claiming that he was giving all the international money to his control and the like, that the U.S. and Canada and others instigated. That of course has failed, and this is a further confirmation of that. Which is interesting. That's one of the most crass Canadian-backed bids to overthrow a government that has failed, that I'm familiar with. One of the things that's interesting in the Venezuela dynamic is that about a week ago, Venezuela held a referendum on territory it disputes with its neighbor Guyana. The Essequibo area, very sparsely populated, I think about 150,000 people. It's a big chunk of Guyana's territory, very sparsely populated. I think it's predominantly indigenous people. They speak a number of different indigenous languages. Guyana is about 800,000 people, so it's a very small country, and about 150,000 people. Now, the area has become quite, sort of considered unimportant for a long time. This is a territory dispute that goes back more than 100 years. from Venezuela's perspective, Britain stole this territory, and then when it was brought to this international tribunal, they back in I think 1899, they pulled some shenanigans and the legal shenanigans, and then documents came out later suggesting the British had conspired with Russians at this international tribunal, and then the Venezuelan government back in the 1960s restarted a claim over this territorial dispute with Guyana, and so this is a long-standing issue. But what's reignited it is that there's huge amounts of oil that's been found, and Exxon has been extracting that oil from the area. And basically, from Venezuela's perspective, if they don't move on this issue soon, then all the wealth, the oil wealth, will be extracted. Now, Exxon has gotten a really good deal with the Guyanese government, and interestingly, I wrote about this 2 years ago. An article titled "Canada Pushes Guyana into Conflict with Venezuela and Helps Multinationals Grab Its Oil." And so I should just say that so Venezuela had a referendum. The Maduro government organized a referendum with a number of questions around this territorial dispute with Guyana a week ago, and that now it's kind of heating up. There's a small possibility of some sort of military operation. I think that's unlikely, but that's sort of floating around out there. And the Americans, of course, are using this to justify deepening their military presence in the region. But as I pointed out a couple years ago, there's a couple elements to this that are interesting from a Canadian perspective, which is that when the Guyanese government, there's lots of controversy over the deal they made with Exxon. First of all, there's a whole bunch of Canadian, particularly from Newfoundland companies, oil extraction companies, have been heavily involved in this process and supporting the process. And 3 years ago, I think it was, Canada basically, it looks like, it's not totally confirmed, but it looks like they instigated this review of the concession with Exxon. And Canada, it looks like, financed this process. And then Alison Redford, who's the former premier of Alberta, led up this delegation of consultants to review ExxonMobil's project, which was being widely criticized for low royalty rates. And so Canada's right at the heart of this process of this extraction, but which is really widely criticized within Guyana about its poor ecological damage and poor good deal for the oil company. But so this is going on, and then there's this tension with Venezuela. It's a very interesting country because it's about 800,000 people, as I mentioned. I think it's like about a quarter, about 250,000 expatriates live in Toronto. Okay, so like I think there's as many people from Guyana living in Toronto as there is in the capital, in Georgetown. And they've been very influential within Guyana, and Canada has been really influential in the country going back more than a century, right? Canadian banks, the trolley lines early on at the early 1900s, Canadian owned. Canada garrisoned Guyana militarily during World War II. There was an effort to annex Guyana at the late 1800s as part of Canada's effort to annex the British colonies in the Caribbean, which even became almost a formal process at the end of World War I, where Canada tried to get those colonies. And then if you go right through the years, Alcan, the Montreal bauxite aluminum company, huge operations in Guyana, very during the colonial period, under British rule, and all kinds of influence. Then later period, you have Canada being right in the middle of this aggressive structural adjustment program, financing in the 1980s. So I think it's really underexplored how influential Canada has been in Guyana. And now as we see this sort of tensions heating up with Venezuela, it's important to, and Canada has a role. And to be honest with you, I haven't actually taken the time to really did some pretty heavy research a couple years ago, but I haven't taken the time recently to look at Canada's role in the oil sector. And I'm sure it actually goes much deeper than sort of I'm aware of or people are aware of right now in terms of the current conflict. And so in that context, there's just a report that the U.S. Army South is preparing for something called Trade Winds 2024, which will be held in Barbados with security forces from Caribbean countries, U.S., Canada, France, Netherlands, and the U.K. And there's been a couple of things I've seen about U.S., Canadian naval presence near Venezuela, Guyana, as part, again, of this U.S. Deepening its military relationship to Guyana, and because Venezuela is being, I think, a little bit belligerent, certainly from the Guyanese perspective. I mean, they did a referendum about this territory, and the indigenous people there weren't asked to vote. And so, while I obviously side with Venezuela in the context of the U.S. Canada bid to overthrow its government, the dynamic between Venezuela and Guyana is a different dynamic. Obviously, Venezuela is a much bigger country. And of course, if you're going to talk about taking a whole bunch of territory, you have to be the people who actually live there need to be, and particularly when they're indigenous people, they obviously need to be consulted. So these dynamics are, it's not clear cut that this is just the U.S. Trying to go at Venezuela, but Venezuela's sort of belligerent posture kind of somewhat forces the Guyanese government into looking towards the U.S. Now, of course, the U.S. is also kind of spurring that dynamic, and Canada's spurring that dynamic. But nonetheless, it's still a kind of complicated political dynamic there. There's a Canadian dimension story about a whole series of votes Canada's had at the United Nations General Assembly. And the story published today titled "Canada Votes Against Democracy, Human Rights at UN, Promotes Mercenaries Sanctions." And just shows how Canada is just completely offside on a whole series of UN resolutions against most of the world, and very much siding with the US and the NATO bloc. With regards to Ukraine, we're having more of this kind of panic about the conservatives backing away, it looks like, from the NATO proxy war. And Melanie Joly tweeted, quote, "Ukrainians are on the front line fighting not just for their freedom, but ours as well. Poilievre's conservatives have abandoned their support for Ukraine, but we never will." Okay. And then you have NDP foreign affairs critic Heather McPherson tweeting out, quote, "Unbelievably, the Conservative Party has voted against support for Ukraine again. The Conservatives are hoping no one notices that early this morning they voted against $500 million to support the delivery of equipment and services to Ukraine in the defense of its sovereignty. Shame." And I have no doubt that the NDP and the Liberals are exaggerating what the Conservatives actually voted against. They no doubt of doing that, but it's clear that the Conservatives are willing to start backing away from some of this huge amounts of weapons and other forms of assistance that Canada's been providing to Ukraine. And that follows with what we've seen in the US, and the big package that the Biden administration wanted to send to Ukraine is being stalled. Doesn't look like it's going to pass. And Zelensky is going to be in Washington tomorrow, apparently, to try to a final last ditch push for this package, because they're basically panicking that that this is going to lead to basically Ukraine losing. They're already losing, but further losing. And that's what the head of NATO state said, that expect be prepared for bad news from Ukraine. There's a whole bunch of stories now in the corporate media talking about the divisions within Ukrainian between Zelensky and the head of the military. There's all these political divisions that you had the mayor of Kyiv, the former boxer there, basically say that Zelensky is a dictator. And so there's lots of political disputes blowing up within Ukraine, which speaks to the fact that there's failure at the counteroffensive, and now in fact Russia's on the advance. All of this, of course, is just it's sort of horrible. This war from the get-go was horrible. There was ways out of this. I've been very critical of Russia for invading, but of course there's also lots of context that's generally ignored in our media, in terms of provocation, in terms of the previous war, the war in the Donbass, and our role in spurring that with the coup, etc. So it doesn't look, the prospects, as I've mentioned multiple weeks now in a row here, that the situation does not look good for Ukrainians, and that seems to be continuing. One of the people on the left that seems to be the most fanatic proponents of the NATO proxy, and I use the word fanatic, like genuinely, is Maud Barlow. I've talked about Maud Barlow, the former head of the Council of Canadians, on previous sessions, and recently I did a look at 2 months of her posts on Twitter, or X now called, and I knew that I would find some stuff that Maud Barlow wasn't, I disagreed with her. Now, I did it in part because I think it's really illuminating to look at people who were real hardline NATO proxy warriors, and I knew she was one of them. I didn't know exactly how staunchly so until going through it sort of methodically. But to look at their position on Palestine, and I think it's very incongruent, right? You'll find that the people who are the hardline NATO proxy warriors basically go completely silent on Palestine, and that's what I found with Maud Barlow. And I went over 2 months since early October, and nothing. The only thing that was critical on Palestine that she put out was a statement from the Secretary General of the UN that had a really mild, like, end the violence, called for like humanitarian, end the violence, kind of implicitly critical of Israel, but not, barely so. That was it. That was stunning. She had multiple posts about anti-Semitism, multiple posts criticizing Hamas for October 7th and all things around that, and these just exaggerated claims of what happened on October 7th, just the totally coming out of the anti-Palestinian lobby. Posts about anti-Semitism, same thing. They were basically echoing the anti-Palestinian lobby's position on what happened at Concordia, what happened at these protests against different cafes, the boycott couple cafes in Toronto, and smearing it as if it was protests against Jewish business, when there are long-standing boycotts of those cafes. And you can debate one way or another about whether boycotts are a good thing or not, this and that, but there was very clear political reasons for these boycotts calls, and so she's. But and then on Palestine, or on Ukraine, she's just, like I said, she's totally fanatical, like dozens and dozens of posts, over the top posts on all kinds of things. So basically, Russia is behind the war in the Middle East, things like that. That everyone that's an ally of Russia, kind of implying that Hamas is an ally of Russia, has to be our enemy, stuff like that. So she has one that says Russia is arming, financing, planning, and sharing intelligence with any regime or terror group that is willing to wage war on the West. And Putin could be totally stopped by merely arming Ukrainians that are willing to do all the heavy lifting. Western weakness is incredible. This isn't her words. This is her retweeting or reposting these things, this tweet. But just really over the top stuff. And then she goes into the full-on support of the U.S. empire, full-on support of the U.S. empire. One with Max Boot, a neocon, saying, quote, if Trump regains the White House, he would be likely to abandon both NATO and Ukraine. U.S. allies in East Asia, which depend on U.S. troop deployments, notably South Korea and Japan, would also be at risk of abandonment. So, like, everywhere, right? On from Palestine to Iran to NATO proxy war to China, Maud Barlow supports the U.S. empire, and her Twitter feed is absolutely crystal clear about that. And this is somebody who led for I think decades the Council of Canadians. She was very identified with the anti-corporate globalization movement. That was the movement that kind of brought me to political activism, which I engaged with for multiple years. And she's just a total neocon, really, just a neocon on international affairs. It's pretty remarkable to see. So it took me aback. It's not totally surprising considering the history of left-wing groups aligning with Canadian imperialism, which I've of course written about in a Left-Right Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada. But nonetheless, what Maud Barlow was putting out, I knew she was anti-Palestinian. I have friends, Council Canadian going back a decade, who told me that she was a real block to Palestinian activism within the council. Back in 2006, the council published this report on peacekeeping that celebrated Canada's role in Haiti, right? This is 2 years after the coup, where Canada helped overthrow the elected government. There was Canadian, at that time, there were Canadian police led the policing component of the UN mission. And of course, thousands of people were killed in the aftermath of the coup. So this was, obviously very outrageous for the council to publish a report like that while she was the head of the group. And so, I knew that it wasn't very good when it came to foreign policy, but it's far worse than I even expected. On China, there's a few developments. There's a story in the business section of the Globe, one of the senior columnists, titled "Modern Slavery Act Sets Floor, Not Ceiling, for Firms to Ensure Ethical Supply Chains." And talking about this Canadian fishing foods company, I think High Liners is named, High Liner Foods, and getting a fish where there's possibly some labor that are Uyghurs, and this whole forced labor, and this big push to basically sanction all of the fishing industry in China because of the Uyghur connection. There's American officials calling on Canada to follow the U.S., which basically has a law going back 2 or 3 years that says that any products coming from Xinjiang, that the assumption is there's forced labor. And so it's up to the firm to prove that there wasn't forced labor to allow the products in or whatnot. And so there's a push for Canada to follow that, and this whole fishing push and the alleged allegations of forced labor on Chinese fishing ships, which of course, if you look geographically, it's quite far from Xinjiang to the coast. So that's pushing. I've talked about that in previous sessions. That's moving along. The Chinese state-run media criticized the government, Canada, for the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Montreal, which they say violates the One China principle and sends the wrong signal to Taiwan authorities. There's a number of reports on the whole foreign interference question. The New York Times did a big piece about China purportedly electing Han Dong, titled "He Won Ottawa's Seat, but did Beijing help?" That's Han Dong, the Liberal MP from Toronto, and they rehash some of the allegations out there, and then they do point out at the end. So Han Dong wants to he was kicked out of Liberal caucus, of course, and the allegations seem to have collapsed. Realistically, he's suing Global News and whatnot. The collapse because the former Governor General, the investigation found that there was no evidence. But it's continue on. He's Hendong's still not in the Liberal caucus, and now all those far right forces that were going after Governor General, I'm forgetting his name right now. They claim that he was appointed by Harper, but they claim he was buddies with Trudeau because one time, like 40 years ago, Pierre Trudeau, I think, parked at his cottage and left the kids there for an hour or something like that. I forget it was pretty tangential. But David Johnston, thank you. Now all those forces that were going after David Johnston for being apparently a Trudeau buddy, now they're saying that the new commission is all a sham. And so one of them titled the National Post from that, is it Pat? I forget her name now. She's on CBC as well. Anyways, the title of the piece is "Another Sham Inquiry is Unfolding." So it basically doesn't matter what, they've decided China's running our government. They've elected the Trudeau, and anything that doesn't show that China elected Trudeau is pretty much a sham inquiry. That's pretty much where we're at on the foreign interference. Another thing on the foreign interference front, probably a bit more in the realm of the realistic, is Journal de Montréal had a piece titled "Diaspora inquiète." Worried diaspora, about the Canada-India Global Forum, and basically about the role of Modi's government in promoting a certain type of Indian nationalism and a sort of Hindu nationalist kind of perspective, and their role in Canada. And it goes through there's a new report that came out about some of this stuff, and the story goes into some of that. And I think that is a form of foreign interference, and that is happening. I think there is also Chinese interference in different ways as well, far less, of course, than the U.S. or Israeli. And there was a story about Israeli interference, much more kind of a concrete details, which is basically that this is in the breach. The Israeli consulate in Toronto funded a poll, and basically a totally dubious poll trying to show that Canadians didn't really want a ceasefire, and Canadians all backed, killing Palestinians and whatnot. And they fund this poll, but then they start pushing it around without mentioning that they were the ones who funded it. And apparently they got it, trying to push it to this group called the Libs for Israel, which is some sort of informal liberal assistance, I think former MPs, kind of, players in Ottawa, that is Liberals for Israel. I never heard about it. It's just, I think in this form, it's just some sort of maybe on WhatsApp or some sort of group, some social media like that. And they tried to get it pushed in those, the Israeli consulate and their people got it pushed. Now, to me, this is a much more, this is a concrete form of foreign interference. The consulate of another country commissioning a poll, dubious one, pushing that, hiding that they were the ones behind it, etc. Now, obviously, what we're seeing that Israel's doing is just absolutely beyond, quite honestly, beyond belief. We're now at least 18,000 killed directly. There's the poet and scholar Rafit Al-Harir was killed a few days ago, and his sister and their kids. Almost for sure a targeted strike. I don't know him. I've never met him, but I was followed him on Twitter and read lots of his messages, and obviously know lots of people on the left and pro-Palestinian people who knew him, and so I've seen lots of this, sort of, anecdotes about him and stuff in recent days. Very horrible. There's also the head of the World Health Organization is also talking about, it's not just about the direct killings, but the health effects and the lack of food, sanitation, poor sanitation, hygiene, waste management, etc., and goes through all the different diseases that are already starting to explode in Gaza, and all evidence, the colder weather is going to exacerbate this, and all evidence is to suggest that this is just going to get worse and worse. And our government is right there supporting all this. There were 97 states that co-sponsored the UN Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. Canada, of course, wasn't one of those 97 states that symbolically co-sponsored. The US vetoed that resolution. The UK abstained. Every other member of the Security Council voted for it. And apparently tomorrow there's going to be a new resolution brought to the General Assembly. And I don't know the rules, but I think it's like if 75% of the General Assembly supports it, I think it goes through. I don't know exactly how this works or what it means exactly, but there is some new effort that I just saw coming tomorrow on that front. Canada's, supporting all this, right? Like there's Melanie Joly. There's this big campaign began 5 or 6 days ago by the Israeli propaganda machine to hype up allegations of rape on October 7th. This is it doesn't, on the surface of it, just doesn't make sense that Hamas fighters that were in a hurry, all these reports about they thought they had the short period of time they thought they had to go get in, attack Israeli military bases and or get hostages and bring them back into Gaza. It was all time sensitive. There's one story I was reading about how they actually, one of the kibbutzes, they had a lot of time to leave. They thought the Israeli soldiers were already there, and they could have got out, but they because Israeli soldiers took like 3 hours or 4 hours, something like that. And but they just assumed that within an hour or whatever the time frame was exactly, that the Israeli soldiers would already been out front, and so they just hold themselves up. So this business of like any sort of substantive rapes when you're in this huge hurry just doesn't make any sense. Just really doesn't make sense. But the Israeli propaganda apparatus, as a way to divert from their slaughter of more than 5,000 Palestinian women, around 4,000 Palestinian girls, they have really hyped up this believe Israeli women, and you see this whole process of how the propaganda apparatus push it, and then Americans get in. And Melanie Joly, right? Melanie Joly makes this post about believing Israeli women. There aren't actually Israeli women that have come forward. But it gets picked up, and it's all, this is now 2 months later. Doesn't matter how much killing Israel commits, we're supposed to think about what, these, even if they were true, obviously, if there was any rapes, obviously to be condemned, horrible, should be prosecuted, but most likely, certainly at the macro level, this is just this complete hype. There may have been one or two, but as a sort of mass thing, but Joly joins the fray, and this is all about justifying changing the channel from the what we're seeing, the killing, and it's just part of, also Canada voted against the UN resolution backed by almost every country, condemning Israel's settlements, and they did so even after, according to Canadian Justice of Peace in the Middle East, 7,500 people emailed Bob Rae and Global Affairs to support, calling on them to support the resolution. The Iranian foreign minister yesterday, or maybe it was even earlier today, said, quote, the governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, given their historic and continuous support to the Israeli regime and their publicly political, military, intelligence, and media support for the regime's war crimes in Gaza over the past 2 months, should be held to account as accomplices in the crimes. And it's really hard to argue with the Iranians for that. And it, of course, shows the total hypocrisy of Canada's moralizing on towards Iran or other countries on their violence and their repression. I found out that the individual that's in charge of the Israel-Gaza file or Israel-Palestine file in the Prime Minister's office is somebody named Harry Orbach Miller. Harry Orbach Miller, very quick search online. He was an intern, parliamentary intern with the Canadian Jewish Public Affairs Committee back in for a year and a half or a bit more than that, 2017 to 2019. He went to Tannenbaum Chat High School, which holds it's the biggest private school in the country. It holds IDF days. He last year went on a lobby-sponsored trip to Israel. Israel lobby-sponsored. He has met, according to a quick search of the lobbyist registry, he has met with CIJA more than a dozen times. He met once or twice, I think I saw, with B'nai B'rith as well. Not once has he met with any, according to the registry at least, any Palestine group. So that's the person in charge of the Canada-Israel file in the PMO office. So it doesn't surprise you that, I mean, you know, these positions they matter, and they are also reflective, of course. Trudeau is appointing him in that position because he's already decided that's going to be his politics on this issue, and then it also then reinforces it, of course. On the media front, we're seeing just wild levels of propaganda. Of course, there's a story that about Canadian Justice, CJPME, published about how Post Media, the biggest newspaper outlet in the country, they publish stories from I think the JNS, Jewish National Wire Service, and it's just this like fanatically pro-Israel, close to the Israeli military news agency, and that began about a decade ago or something like that. And they publish lots of stories from them that come across as like wire stories, as if it's sort of like Associated Press and Reuters, Canadian Press, which those agencies already are too close to sources of power. But this is even one step further and just totally subordinate to the Israeli government and military. So last week Monday, there was the big genocide rally. Wasn't actually that big, a few thousand people in Parliament Hill supporting genocide. And the next day, the Montreal Gazette and National Post had a very prominent on the front page, and the Globe and Mail also had a photo on the front page, a bit smaller. A week before, when at least 5, probably 10 times as many people, maybe even, about 10, maybe 10 times as many people protested, rallied on Parliament Hill against genocide, and then actually marched all around Ottawa. Those papers didn't even mention this in print, at least, the protests. So pretty crass example of the pro-Israel bias in the media, where their demonstrations, much smaller demonstrations, get front page, and the pro-Palestinian demonstrations just get ignored. The CTV reporting on the demo, Omar Sachedina reported, the CTV news anchor. He referred to it as a pro-war rally in Ottawa, and the genocide lobby went completely bananas, totally bananas, all over social media for daring to call it a pro-war rally. Personally, I think it's right to be critical of CTV for calling a pro-war rally. It's not a pro-war rally. It was a pro-genocide rally. It's not a war between Hamas and Israel. It's a colonial power murdering and trying to ethnically cleanse a long oppressed people, and it's genocidal, very clearly so. So I think pro-war is way too light, but this led to a huge backlash on social media, and even people like Jesse Brown from Canadaland, who's gone completely off the deep end. He's supposed to be a monitor of like media bias, and he basically said that quote, to falsely call peaceful protesters against anti-Semitism and for the release of hostages war supporters is to label them fair game for harassment and even violence. So he's saying that CTV calling it war supporters is basically, you know, calling for the next pogrom. There's going to be pogroms in Toronto and Montreal because of CTV calling this war supporters. And that's the critical media voice, which is just an absolutely remarkable state of affairs. There's a big kerfuffle around the beginning of Hanukkah in Calgary, principally, where the mayor withdrew after the organizers. The mayor is gone for decades for the official ceremony. The mayor had planned to go, and then the organizers turned it into a pro-genocide rally, and then the mayor pulled out under pressure from anti-genocide people. That huge big kerfuffle, front page of the Globe or National Post. Calgary mayor snub emboldens anti-Semites. Seeing reports of pray for IDF at these Hanukkah celebrations. Olivia Chow, the Toronto mayor, and the Vaughan mayor went to the events, which were explicitly promoted as, quote, rallying for Israel. On Sunday night in Hampstead, I attended the event because I heard that Anthony Housefather was going to be there. And I tried to challenge him about killing Palestinian children. He actually just literally ran away, and then he ran away from a second question. Tried to do it in a fairly respectful manner because there were kids there. The Israeli consular was there, and there was Israeli flags and whatever. But Hanukkah's actually, I personally have kind of like fond feelings towards it. It's quite troubling how it's being turned into a pro-genocide kind of forum. But at this event in Hampstead, I asked the mayor of Hampstead if he would.
You support, you support killing 8,000 Palestinian children?
Whenever this is like a specific therapy, they have to do whatever they have to do to make sure that they do.
Even 20,000 Palestinian children were killed, you're still supporting Israel? It doesn't matter, 50,000 Palestinian children killed?
It's my heart goes out to all the innocent people who suffered great loss from this tragedy. But it's prevailed over you.
So 100,000 Palestinian children killed, they still support that? You support Israel no matter what it is. No matter what it is. So you dropped the nuclear weapon and got that. Thank you.
So he wasn't willing to say he'd support dropping a nuclear weapon. That was a step too far. But 100,000 Palestinian children that would be if that's what's needed for, as he put it, good to prevail over evil. So good to prevail over evil could include killing 100,000 Palestinian children. It's still good. Good is still prevailing over evil at 8,000 Palestinian children, and no problem at 20. That was pretty easy for him. 50, 100 sort of seemed to maybe question a little bit. Unbelievable. Just this is the mayor of Hampstead, which is a inner suburb of Montreal. Fascinating place. It was set up as part of the British late 1800s British. I'm totally blanking on the name. Garden City movement. I did a book on cars, and a decade of 15 years ago, I did a lot of research on urban planning and stuff like that. But and so this is basically a movement of kind of elites moving out of the city center. Begins in Britain, and so a Canadian version, a Montreal version, I think in 1915, gets set up by these wealthy Montrealers who set up this exclusive. There's no commercial, there's no industrial land in Hampstead. It's just residential. So it's very exclusive. It's the second wealthiest municipality in Quebec after Westmount. And so historically it was a WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. It was elite WASP enclave. And since World War II, it's become like 80% Jewish. And it really reflects Jewish ascendance in Montreal. And it's basically, I mean, you heard the mayor, just totally fanatical, pro-apartheid kind of outlook. And they're the ones who the mayor, he put forward this thing about bringing in a $1,000 or $1,500 fine for anyone found to be taking down posters about hostages, the hostages that Hamas took. That's how I begin the conversation with him. I edited a little bit of the before part about the hostages and ask him about supporting a ceasefire, because that's what the hostages' families are calling for, is an exchange with Hamas with the prisoners, that the hostages that Israel has of Palestinians, many more for the hostages Hamas has, and he's not in support of. He's all about the hostages, but he's not actually in support of a ceasefire and that exchange. So, anyways, so Hampstead is this very exclusive place, and it's just this hub of like extreme anti-Palestinian Zionism, and that's the mayor, who was quite, he didn't have any problem saying this all on camera, right? He was totally comfortable with making these comments. Moving on, I don't have that much time. I'm taking a little longer than I expected again, unfortunately. Just to say, Ben Gurion University, Canada fundraising arm, had a gala in Toronto, I think Tuesday or Wednesday, with Sylvan Adams, Montreal billionaire. He announced $100 million US to Ben Gurion University to support the South in the post Hamas incursion context. $100 million donation to Israeli University. That will be partly subsidized by Canadian taxpayers. And that whole question of charities is just absolutely underexplored. How much subsidy Canadian taxpayers are given to projects in Israel, a country with a GDP per capita equivalent to Canada's, and this donation by Sylvan Adams. There's a story in the National Post, conversely, and we hear about this a lot, about money going to charities in Gaza, Palestinian, very formal international charities, and they're claiming, these pro-Israel groups claiming that they have connections to Hamas and this and that. And so you hear this kind of constant stream of stories on that direction, but when it's openly registered Canadian charities are supporting the Israeli military, openly in contravention of Canada Revenue Agency rules, supporting West Bank settlements, openly against Canada Revenue Agency rules, racist organizations, openly against Canada Revenue Agency rules, the media won't touch it. They won't touch it, even if you can show the proof of this. But nonetheless, the Canada Revenue Agency has been willing to act on some of this stuff. Now, the Montreal Gazette had a story about the police chief of Montreal, titled "Police Chief Reassures Jewish Community of Its Safety at Virtual Meeting." And in this story, the Jewish community representative asks explicitly the police chief whether there's a way to limit, whether a limit could be imposed on the number of pro-Palestinian demonstrations. So they're openly saying, calling on the head of police, they're saying, there's anti-Semitism, and so you have to shut down pro-Palestinian demonstrations. That's the position. Fortunately, the police chief rejects it, but it creates a certain climate. Now, on that front, though, we see it continued. I mean, the mobilizations. Today, 2 mobilizations here in Montreal. There was a protest, an occupation at the Zim office downtown, 20, 30 people. Police came. People were blocking in the front of the office. Police came. Then later in the day, there was about 300 that rallied and then marched to the mall. I left early, so I didn't march to the mall, but I saw images online of marching through the mall. On Wednesday or Thursday night, Melanie Joly had a fundraiser, and at least 300 people showed up. 3 hours, bitter cold, -12, -15, bitter cold. 3 hours. People, many stayed for 3 hours. On Saturday, this is the 10th week in a row. There's at least 5,000 people. At least 5,000 people marched. 10th week in a row here in Montreal with mass protests. I got this image from a souk, which is, I don't know how you pronounce it. It's between Victoria and Nanaimo. And it's from this Liberal Party. It was a Liberal Party fundraiser here that was disrupted, but a Liberal Party fundraiser on this farm on Vancouver Island. And there's a young Jewish guy, I think Hasidic. He's got the curly hair and yarmulke, and they're reading out. There's like 3 or 4 of them. They're reading out the names of all the dead Palestinians. All the Palestinians have been killed. And this liberal organizer totally loses it, and like really aggressively, like 100-meter pushes the guy, runs him off the farm. But the point here is that this is a farm on Vancouver Island, Liberal Party fundraiser, and there's like 3 or 4 people going there to disrupt it, right? So this is a popular uprising. Obviously, it's not as big and strong as we would like to. We haven't had the victory that we would like in terms of even the minimum on the ceasefire resolution, but the fact that there's this mass protests, so many different cities that continue now 10 weeks in, even in cold weather, it's remarkable. Obviously, what Israel's doing is just beyond belief horrendous, and it's obviously in response to that. But we should also, take some comfort from the level of resistance. I'll leave it there. And I'm gonna I'll first unmute Laura, and I'll make you a co-host as well.
Great, and thanks. So far, I'm the only one with my hand up, so I get to use my prerogative to be first. I have 2 questions. One is, could you just talk a little bit about how powerful Christian Zionism is in Canada? And the second thing is, as people prepare to go home for Christmas, and they're talking to relatives who are more mainstream than many of us would be, in the sense that they just consume mainstream news, and they want to talk about what Canada's role has been for the last 2 months in Israel. Could you tell people what have been the key things Canada has done in the last couple of months that supports what Israel is doing, the genocide, and what we would like these relatives to do, actions that they can take to kind of try to influence the government to behave otherwise?
Yeah, so I stated this recent session, I don't remember which one. Zionism begins as a Christian movement in Canada, right? Christian Zionism begins before Jewish Zionism. And there was a whole movement, and I quote it multiple times in my Canada-Israel book, going back to Confederation. Henry Wentworth Monk was the most influential Zionist. And the same thing is the case in Europe. There's Christian Zionism for a couple centuries before Theodor Herzl and that movement gets on the scene. Now today, so when Canada was a more religious Christian country, that now it mostly almost mostly Protestant, limited on the Catholic side. You look at like Lester Pearson, right? So Lester Pearson, just read a story about from this right-wing source about Pearson's role in the partition plan in 1947. And they make the quote about Pearson. He says that he knew more about, because his dad and I think his grandfather were both Protestant ministers, that he knew more about the Holy Land or Palestine than the geography of it than he knew of Canada for many years of his life, because he was reading all these stories in the Bible and whatnot. So someone like Lester Pearson was a Christian Zionist. Same thing with Ivan Siran, the Canadian who's central to the partition plan. So there was strong, cultural, religious, whatever you want to call that exactly, forces for many, many, many decades. That continues. I think Canada's a substantially less Christian country today. But there still is organized Christian Zionist movement. It's not as close to as strong as in the U.S., but sometimes they say 8%, 10% are like Protestant fundamentalists, and a significant number of them are Christian Zionists. The most well known is the Canada Christian College, which is outside of one of the, I think I'm not sure if it's in Toronto proper, it's one of the suburbs. They had long did events with B'nai B'rith where they got thousands of people out. Charles McVety, who is a disciple of John Hagee, I think he's in Texas, U.S. Christian Zionist. Yeah, so it's and I think when you in Harper you see some of that. Now with regards to today, what the Canada support? I mean, the obvious thing is they can't even call for a ceasefire. Basically, everyone in the world, very few countries have not called for a ceasefire. The fact Trudeau can't call for a ceasefire, that's the simple thing. I think polls show that most Canadians want a ceasefire. The other ways Canada supported in the direct last 2 months sense is Melanie Joly's visit there. That was definitely designed to give a boost of support for Israel's killing in Gaza. And the UN resolutions, right? They say they want a two-state solution, but they can't even vote to condemn the settlements like a couple of days ago that they themselves say are contrary to international law. Then you get into the bigger question of just the sort of broad ways in which Canada supports Israel. And I think the one that's the most egregious for people, it's more maybe a bit complicated for people to get into, but the one that's most egregious is the charities. Right? I think it's the most important one, and it's most egregious. Why are we like, why would Canadian taxpayers subsidize giving donations to things that contravene CRA rules? But even broader, why would we subsidize just giving donations to like even good projects in Israel, right? Why are we subsidizing that? Israel's a wealthy country. We're not doing that we're not doing that with Sweden. We're not doing that with France. Why are we doing that with Israel? So I think that to me, the discussing the charities question and the fact that a number of them already support Israeli military, support settlement projects that contravene currently existing CRA rules, that to me is an issue that needs to be sort of brought up, because it's, I think, very difficult for the Israel lobby forces to defend themselves. And that's part of why they don't. They mostly just try to stay away from that discussion.
But just know you didn't transfer the power to me, so I can't ask Frank to.
Oh, I didn't. I thought I made you a co-host.
Well, I can't. I don't have any. You made me you mute, but anyway, I can't do it. Can you unmute Frank?
I think I just did. I tried
Okay,
to.
go ahead, Frank.
Hi, I'll be quick, but just two things, and maybe people in the chat could I live in Toronto and I want to do something about this, and I don't know who to contact in Toronto to find out what's going on and what I can do and what's anything is gonna be happening. And the second thing, if Trudeau and the Liberal Party found a moral spine or got their heads out of their rear ends, what do you think would happen to Canada if they actually took some concerted, serious actions to criticize Israel, like just as a power thing in the world?
Well, we saw when Trudeau did actually make a statement that was, basically saying, please try not to kill babies. Netanyahu had a big freak out, and a bunch of Israeli ministers tweeted harsh condemnation of Trudeau. And because Israel has a well-organized lobby within Canada, and because the Conservatives are even more anti-Palestinian, and the media is so anti-Palestinian, there was a lot of like pushback to what was not, nothing. I mean, his criticism was way too late and way too mild, but then you had like former ambassador. Harper's ambassador to Israel calling Trudeau an anti-Semite, like absolutely straightforward. Justin Trudeau is and always has been an anti-Semite. I think that's basically the word for word, the quote. So Trudeau would feel heat. I don't think in the global, I think there's an internal dynamic that is the main obstacle in the short term for a better position.
It's just words then.
It's just, well, it's words, the words can translate. Like, I think that we shouldn't Canada making statements and moving away from Israel matters, because Canada has been, with the US and UK, have been the most important backers for a century of Zionism, right? Of Israel and Zionism. So it does echo through Israeli politics, even words, let alone action, right? There's all kinds of actions they could take. They could stop offering permits for arms sales. They could start investigating recruitment for the Israeli military in Canada. They could move against charities. There's a slew of things they can do that would have consequence, have an effect, impact Israeli politics and economy and whatnot. Now, Israel's become quite a powerful country. It wasn't, if you go historically, Canada was more important to Israel because it was not close to as powerful as it is today. But yeah, so I at some point there would be a backlash from the US, of course, and that is in the background to understanding Canada's policy, is that this is about alignment, and it's always been that way, from alignment with British, with the Balfour Declaration, to alignment with with Washington. So the main, imperial patron of Israel and Zionism, Canada has been, its relationship to the main imperial patron has been central to understanding Canada's pro-Israel position. But I don't think in the short term, I don't think the US is. I don't think the backlash would be that intense in the short term, at least from if Canada came out in favor of a ceasefire, I don't think there would be some big, I don't think that would lead to, Anthony Blinken, doing anything of substance, towards Melanie Joly or Canada, whatever, right? I think that those kind of things in the shorter medium term is more about internal, the Israel lobby and internal politics, and the ability to sort of cause Trudeau. Trudeau's top fundraiser is Bronfman, right? Stephen Bronfman, who's boasted back in 2013 that he was becoming Trudeau's top fundraiser, partly because for Israel. That was Israel. He brought up Israel as being central to it all. Now, conversely, you see that, I don't know if people saw this, a group of influential Muslim donors to the Liberal Party, according to the CBC article. I think they've given him $650,000 to the Liberal Party, and Liberal raised 14.5 million last year, so they gave 650,000 or something like that, which is a sizable chunk of 14.5 million. They have all come out. They've come out saying they won't donate to the party, or maybe to specific MPs, specific ridings, but they won't donate to the broader party over the question of Palestine, over what they're supporting what Trudeau's supporting right now. So there are there's some of those dynamics. The voting, there's voting elements, but I think the voting element it's complicated. It plays both ways. There's some ridings that where there's like Anthony Housefather, where there's big, the Hampstead where I was talking about, where there's big Jewish communities that it's a bit in play. The Conservatives have a possibility of winning there. So a couple of the Toronto ridings, same kind of dynamic. There's vote, but then on the other side, there's Palestinian or Arab or Muslim voters in some ridings. Some of those kind of for the Liberal Party is kind of plays both ways. But yeah, so I think there's room for Trudeau to maneuver to UN votes. I think they can change the UN votes. I don't think there's going to be huge backlash from the US if Canada votes in favor of criticizing settlements. Jean Chrétien did that, right? Jean Chrétien's government did that. He voted again. He voted with most of the rest of the world on these resolutions that then Paul Martin started changing, then Harper like really changed, and now Trudeau has just continued that. So there's a bunch of those things which I don't think, they're not sort of fundamental to the Canada-US relationship.
Okay, so Eve, we have a question from Jake. Can you unmute him? Again, I don't have that ability today. Jake Javanshire?
I think I just...
Okay.
Yes, okay. If there is a minute or two left, I would like to talk about Hanukkah, because in the last so many years, Hanukkah developed such a life that people who do not know the story, they think it's one or maybe the most important event in the Jewish history, and perhaps very religious one, and so on. So I presume some do not know the story. Therefore, I tell you what it is. Basically, it's totally a fairy tale story which has no basis in anything. What it was in the Roman times, there were some Romans that fighting some Jewish resistant fighters. Anyways, some of those Jews found a cave and they went inside to hide, and then it was dark. So they found a small can of oil, which should have lasted one day, but by miracle lasted 7 days. That's it. This is the story of Hanukkah. Okay? So for people who do not know, now maybe they think, again, what is Hanukkah? That now politicians going there to light that candle holder, and everybody talks about Hanukkah. That's it.
Yeah, my understanding is that Hanukkah it wasn't an important Jewish holiday until a century or so ago, when German kind of, I guess, more assimilating Jews, their kids wanted to partake in, like, Christmas time, gifts and the whole kind of thing. Personally, as I was saying, my good friend growing up was a atheist. My best friend at the kind of like formed a 6 to 10 year age, when that Christmas kind of stuff is really important. He was an atheist Jew, so his parents had Hanukkah. So I personally have a kind of like warm feelings towards this. I think it was the only really the Jewish holiday that he followed. So I have this warm feelings to it. So it's actually quite, this business of turning it into these genocide rallies, which is really what's happening, is pretty particularly egregious. But that's clearly, you know, the mainstream of the Jewish community in Canada is turning everything they can that's Jewish into basically support apartheid, support genocide. That's what's happening. That's what we're seeing pretty aggressively play out. And it's obviously I mean, it's horrible for Palestinians. It's horrible for Canadian politics. I would venture to guess for long term, from the standpoint of Judaism, it's not very good either. But that's it's not really for me to make that call.
Okay, now Eve, can we take one last question from
Yeah,
Leah
yeah,
Siegel?
yeah.
And if
Yeah.
you could unmute her, please.
I think I have.
So what's the Syrian story about that, about the oil? I heard it today, but I can't place it all together.
Sorry, Leah, could you
Syria.
expand?
Some war with Syria or within Syria.
Jake, well, if Jake can respond, I don't know enough about the background, Hanukkah. Go ahead, Jake.
You're muted.
I think I've.
No,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, the question was about oil in Syria?
well, yeah, I think they're two
There was
different
some
things.
war, no, that was
Yeah.
associated with Syria. The war, there was a fighting, and then the oil came after that. That made them feel so justified because it lasted for 8 days.
I don't know anything. What I said, I grew up in Israel. And when I grew up in Israel, there was nothing. The only thing there was the 7 days they were giving candies to children. But slowly, as Eve said, because of Christmas, the children, Jewish children in diaspora felt left out. And then it started developing a life. And now it became the most important event. Everybody talks about Hanukkah. About the oil, you're talking, the only thing I know
Yeah,
is
but you know, so what about the oil? So what if there was some miracle? So what? What does that mean?
nothing, but they made it into something slowly.
Like that means you're better than the other guy, you know? I'm sorry, you know, like
Anyway, about the oil, it's the oil in Gaza, the oil and natural gas in Gaza, which
that's what we're talking about, the oil
Yeah.
in the ground. That's what
that's
this
where they
about.
want to ethnic cleanse all of Gaza in order to not to give 1 penny to Gaza.
Right. Okay. So Eve,
So thanks everyone. Same place, same time next week. Hope everyone has a good evening. Happy
Thanks,
Hanukkah.
Don't say
Yeah.